I thought I'd feel overjoyed. But when I stared down at the two pink lines, my stomach flipped. Not from fear exactly, but from knowing, deep down, that nothing was ever going to be the same again. I was 26, building my career, full of plans, full of life. Still, in the middle of all that shock, a small part of me smiled, because this was something real, something growing, something mine. I just didn't realize how quickly it would be taken. When I told Andrew, I expected surprise, maybe even panic, but I didn't expect calculation. He didn't reach for me, didn't smile. His eyes just went distant like he was solving a math problem. "A baby would ruin my shot at partner," he said, as if I'd just told him I lost the car keys. No warmth, no questions, just a statement, clear and cold. And from there, it all unraveled. He called me selfish for even thinking about keeping it. Reckless. Irresponsible. "You think love is enough to raise a child?" He'd ask like it was a punchline. Every conversation chipped away at my certainty. And then came the real fear. Not of motherhood, but of losing him. Of ending up alone. So I started convincing myself that this sacrifice was for us. That giving it up meant keeping him. I still remember the clinic. The way the walls were too white. The way the clock seemed louder than it should have been. I filled out the paperwork with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The nurse was kind, but even her softness couldn't cut through the numbness crawling up my spine. I kept thinking about the ultrasound, that tiny flicker on the screen. A heartbeat, quick, steady, undeniably there. I didn't know if it was a boy or girl. I didn't even give it a name. But it existed, and that haunted me more than anything. Afterward, I lay in bed for what felt like days. My body ached in ways I didn't expect. But it was the silence that hurt most. No one called, not even him. When he finally texted, it was short. "Hope you're resting." No apologies, no checking in, like I'd just crossed something off a to-do list. I stared at the screen for hours before finally turning it off. That's when it really hit me. I'd done this for someone who didn't even know how to care. I tried to rationalize it, told myself I'd made the right decision, that it was too soon, too risky, that we weren't ready. But none of those words could drown out what I felt every time I closed my eyes. That flicker on the screen, that heartbeat, that presence, and the crushing realization that I didn't lose it. I gave it away, not because I wanted to, but because I was too afraid to lose him. In the weeks that followed, I became someone else. I smiled when I had to, laughed at the right moments, nodded through conversations I didn't really hear. But inside, I was hollowed out. It wasn't just grief. It was betrayal, though I couldn't name it yet. I replayed our arguments in my head, the pressure he put on me, the way he twisted my hesitation into guilt. He didn't scream. He didn't hit. But somehow, he'd made the decision for both of us, and I let him. I started having these dreams, vivid, disorienting ones. I'd be in a grocery store or walking through a park, and suddenly I'd hear a child laugh, a flash of tiny shoes, a hand tugging at mine. And then nothing. Just air. Just loss. I'd wake up in a sweat, clutching my stomach like I could turn back time. But the truth was always the same. I signed the form. I walked through the door, but he handed me the pen. The world kept spinning, like nothing had happened. But for me, everything had changed. There was no ceremony for this kind of loss, no condolences, no flowers, just silence. And in that silence, one thought kept rising to the surface. One truth I couldn't shake. He made the choice. I just lived with it. It started as something ordinary. I was on Andrew's laptop trying to find a file he asked me to send. He'd left it open, logged in, no passwords needed. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't even suspicious. But a message preview blinked in the corner of the screen, a name I didn't recognize, followed by a sentence that made my skin go cold. "She actually did it. We're clear." My hand froze on the trackpad. My heartbeat wasn't a beat anymore. It was a siren. I clicked. I wish I hadn't. But I clicked, thread after thread, Flirtations that turned into confessions, pictures, reservations, whole weekends I thought he'd spent working, spent with her. She was a junior associate at his firm, young, ambitious, eager to please. The affair had started before I was even pregnant. All that time he was pushing me to make our future easier. He'd already started building a different one, just not with me in it. And then came the message I'll never forget. The one that burned its way into my ribs like acid. Crisis averted. She took care of it. We're good. Like I was a problem he'd solved. Like the child we lost, that I lost, was a smudge on a whiteboard he'd finally wiped clean. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't cry. I just sat there, staring, feeling like I'd been erased all over again. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. Time felt elastic, stretched thin by shock, pulled tight by rage. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling. Part of me wanted to scream, to forward every message to every partner at his firm, to print them, frame them, shove them in his perfect, polished face. But I didn't. I closed the laptop gently, like I might wake a monster if I moved too fast. And then I walked to the bedroom and stared at the space we called ours. It didn't feel like mine anymore. None of it did. The sheets, the books on the nightstand, the framed photos from a trip to Greece, all of it felt staged, like props in a lie I'd been cast into without knowing. I pulled out a small suitcase and began packing. I didn't take much, just the essentials. A few clothes, my journal, the necklace my mother gave me. I left the rest because I didn't want memories. I didn't want explanations. I wanted distance. Before I left, I set my key on the kitchen counter. Right next to the mug he used every morning, the one that said world's best strategist. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was grotesque. He hadn't just taken the child. He hadn't just broken me. He'd rewritten the truth, molded it into something convenient, something sanitized. And now, I wasn't just leaving him. I was leaving the version of me he thought he owned. I didn't leave a note. I didn't send a text. I wanted him to come home and feel the absence like a slap. Let him wonder. Let him sit in the silence of a space no longer curated for his comfort. I hoped he'd call and panic. But when he did, hours later, I let it ring. I wanted him to hear his own voice echo into nothing. He didn't deserve closure. Not after reducing my pain to a crisis averted. Not after treating my body like a legal obstacle he could outmaneuver. I booked a cheap room in a quiet part of town. It smelled like dust and lemon cleaner, and the mattress creaked with every breath. But I slept. Really slept. Not because I was okay, I wasn't, but because for the first time in a long time, I felt alone by choice. I stared at the ceiling and whispered things I hadn't said out loud. It wasn't your fault. You deserved better. You're not crazy. Words I needed to hear from someone, so I became that someone. And somewhere between the hum of the heater and the hum in my chest, I made a promise. Not to forget, but to remember better. To stop replaying his voice in my head and start listening to my own. Because the lie wasn't just that he loved me. The lie was that I needed him to survive the loss. And slowly, without even realizing it, I was beginning to unlearn that. Grief is strange. It doesn't arrive in a straight line. It circles. It stings. It sinks its teeth into the quiet parts of your day. Some mornings I woke up gasping, forgetting where I was. Other times I moved through the world like a ghost, present, but unreachable. I stopped wearing makeup, stopped answering calls. I was mourning something I couldn't name out loud. Because no one throws a funeral for what you chose to let go, even if you were forced to choose it. Therapy saved me in fragments. I remember sitting in that small office, legs crossed, pretending I was fine. The therapist didn't push. She just waited. And when I finally told her about the abortion, about Andrew, about the pressure, she gave it a name. Reproductive coercion. I'd never heard the phrase before, but hearing it out loud felt like someone had finally turned on a light in a room I'd been fumbling through for months. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was erasure. Naming it gave me back a piece of myself. I stopped saying I went through with it and started saying he pushed me into it. I stopped saying we broke up and started saying I left. That shift from passive to active unchanged something in me. I wasn't healed, not even close. But I was starting to understand that what happened to me wasn't just sad, it was wrong. And once you name a wrong, it becomes a fire. The fire didn't rage all at once. It started small, a flicker of defiance in therapy, a refusal to answer Andrew's final, pitiful email. Then came bigger shifts. I re-enrolled in grad school, dusted off ideas I'd buried for years. I launched a small consultancy from my laptop in that same rented room. It wasn't much at first, but it was mine. Every decision, every invoice, every client, I built it without apology, and with each step, I felt a little less like someone broken and more like someone unfinished. There were still nights I'd wake up in a sweat, sure I heard a child crying. I'd check the empty apartment instinctively, like some phantom need still lived in my body. It was like my heart hadn't gotten the memo, that the life it once protected was no longer there. And yet, even in that ache, something had shifted. The grief didn't swallow me anymore. It taught me. It shaped me. And then, when it was ready, it handed me something else entirely. Rage. Not the screaming, table-flipping kind. The quiet, sharp kind. The kind that sits with its back straight. The kind that plans. I didn't want revenge. I wanted truth. I wanted to become the woman who wouldn't need to be rescued from men like Andrew. Not again, not ever. So I stopped looking back. And I started building forward, one solid, stubborn, glorious step at a time. I began reclaiming pieces of my body, my choices, my story. I wore clothes that made me feel powerful. I danced alone in my kitchen to songs I used to skip. I said no without explaining, and yes without guilt. I let myself feel everything, the sorrow, the guilt, the rage, the flickers of joy. Some days I'd stand in front of the mirror and say her name, the name I never gave that first child, just to honor that tiny, flickering heartbeat that had changed me forever, even in its silence. People say time heals, but I don't think that's true. Time reveals. It peels things back. It shows you what you're made of. And what I found, buried under all that pain, was someone I hadn't met before. A woman who could survive being erased and come back sharper, stronger, more alive than ever. And I stopped mourning what I lost and started honoring what I became because of it. He once called it a mistake. He tried to downplay it, file it away in the drawer of things not worth remembering. But for me, it was never just a blip or a detour. It was a turning point, a scar that became a map, a silence that taught me to scream with purpose. He called it a mistake. I called it a memory, and one day I knew it would speak for itself. I wasn't looking for a miracle. In fact, I'd spent years making peace with the idea that motherhood might never be part of my story. So when the test came back positive, again, I didn't cry this time. I didn't panic. I just sat on the edge of my bathtub barefoot, holding a new truth in my hands. It wasn't Andrew's. There was no man waiting in the next room with opinions or ultimatums. Just me. And something that felt, for the first time, like choice. There was no drama, no arguments, no whispered negotiations under cold sheets. This pregnancy didn't come with shame or pressure. It came with silence. And I mean that in the best way. Peaceful silence. A kind of stillness I'd earned. I took long walks, talked to my belly, played music that made me feel held. I didn't rush. I didn't explain myself. And slowly, something opened in me. A space that had been locked up since that first ultrasound. This time I left the door wide open. I started journaling again. Not just for myself, but for whoever this little life inside me would become. I wrote down everything, the fears, the cravings, the dreams. Somewhere along the way, those pages turned into something more structured. A story. My story. And that's when I began documenting it. Not just in words, but in voice recordings, photos, hospital records, timelines. Not for revenge, for truth. Because this time, I wouldn't let anyone else tell it for me. It was during one of those quiet evenings, sitting cross-legged on my living room floor, that I saw his face again, not in a dream, but on the news. Andrew, polished, smiling, standing in front of a podium, announcing his campaign for public office. The headline made my throat tighten. Pro-family, pro-values, pro-accountability. I laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because it was obscene. This man, who once begged me to erase a life for the sake of his career, now branding himself as the protector of families. I watched the video twice, then shut the laptop. Not out of anger, but clarity. It all made sense now. The silence, the pressure, the lies. He hadn't changed. He'd just shifted costumes. And yet here I was, no longer afraid of him, no longer carrying shame, only truth. A truth he hoped would stay buried. But the thing about stories? They find their way to the surface, especially when someone's finally ready to tell them. As I folded another onesie into the drawer, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Ownership. Not just of my body or my choices, but of the entire narrative. This baby didn't come with fear. It came with freedom. I didn't know what motherhood would look like. I didn't have a perfect plan. But I had something more powerful, a sense of self that no one could rewrite. And I knew, as clearly as I knew my own name, that this child would enter the world wrapped not in secrecy, but in truth. I started recording video journals, not just for my future child, but for the woman I used to be. The one who whispered apologies into a clinic pillow, who walked away from a life half built and half lied. I wanted her to see how far we'd come. I wanted her to know that healing isn't neat or fast, but it's possible. That you can lose something and still bloom again. That sometimes the second chance doesn't look anything like the first. And that's the point. Each week, as my body changed, so did my story. I saw softness return to my face, strength to my voice. I started smiling without faking it, laughing from my belly. I painted the nursery a soft green, not for gender, but for growth. I didn't tell many people about the pregnancy, not because I was hiding, but because it felt sacred, intimate, mine. And that privacy, it was powerful, like standing in the eye of a storm, completely untouched. Andrew's campaign was gaining traction. Articles, endorsements, staged family photos. But every time I saw his face, I no longer flinched. I felt something deeper, a knowing. He once asked me to erase a child for the sake of his future. Now I carried one, fully, freely, and without fear. And whether he knew it or not, his reckoning wasn't coming with a scandal. It was coming with a heartbeat, one that wouldn't be silenced this time. I didn't plan it for revenge, I planned it for release. The expose didn't start as a takedown. It started as a letter to my daughter. A letter explaining everything. How she came into this world not in the shadow of shame, but in the full light of truth. How her life wasn't a secret I hid, but a story I wrote with both hands. And how, years before her first breath, another heartbeat had been stolen, not by fate, but by a man who wore ambition like armor. The screenshots were just the beginning. Emails, messages, medical records, therapist notes, all dated, all archived, all undeniable. I blurred my name, kept my face hidden, and published it anonymously on a small but credible platform. I wasn't naive. I knew it would spread. But I didn't want fame. I wanted accountability. I wanted people to see the face behind the slogan, not the polished candidate, but the man who once typed "crisis averted" when a life was lost. It didn't take long. The story caught fire. First whispers on forums, then full-blown headlines. Anonymous whistleblower exposes scandal in rising political stars past. The campaign scrambled. Denials, vague statements, damage control. But the receipts were clear. And when I heard the network anchor read his name alongside the word coercion, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, not glee, just stillness. Like justice, exhaled. The fallout was brutal and fast. Donors pulled out, endorsements evaporated. His staff resigned one by one, like rats from a sinking ship. And Andrew? He did what men like him always do when caught. He blamed a smear campaign, claimed it was a bitter ex. Never said my name, but I could feel the way he choked on it. For the first time, he wasn't holding the narrative, and that, more than anything, unraveled him. I stayed quiet. I didn't do interviews, didn't respond to the speculation. I let the truth do the talking, finally. Meanwhile, I went into labor. Soft music played. A nurse held my hand. And hours later, I gave birth to a daughter with a full head of hair and lungs strong enough to shake the world. I named her Noah, a name that means movement and new beginnings. Because that's exactly what she was, a life that didn't begin in fear, but in power. When they placed her in my arms, I didn't cry. I smiled. I whispered things only she needed to hear, that she was wanted, that she was safe, that she came from a woman who once had everything taken from her and chose to create something better anyway. In that moment, holding Noah, I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt like a creator, like a storyteller. Like someone who had written her truth not in whispers, but in declarations. I never told anyone who Noah's father was. Not because I was hiding anything, but because it didn't matter. She wasn't a product of romance or regret. She was a decision, a declaration, a beginning born entirely on my own terms. People asked, of course, neighbors, friends, even strangers with too much curiosity and not enough tact. I just smiled. Some stories are too sacred for speculation. Some are too powerful to be reduced to paternity. A year later, I released the memoir. Not Yours to Erase, a title that felt like a wound stitched shut. It told everything: the pressure, the pregnancy, the betrayal, the silence. But more than that, it told the journey back to myself. How I found my voice not in vengeance, but in truth. It hit the bestseller list within a week. Book clubs, panels, messages from women across the world who saw themselves in my story. I wasn't alone. I never had been. Andrew disappeared from the headlines. Last I heard, he was consulting quietly somewhere far from cameras and campaigns. But I didn't care. His story ended where mine began. And that was enough. Because in the end, he tried to silence my womb. He tried to rewrite my body like it belonged to him. But I answered in the only way that mattered. Not with a scream, but with a voice that echoed louder than he ever could.